I'm Greg Pliska. I'm Vice President of the Class of '84. One of the reasons we chose to put together this panel on environmental initiatives and sustainability, in part, is because we have an enormous number of people in our class who are involved or connected to this issue in this industry, but more importantly because our class gift, which will be announced in greater detail tomorrow, is to establish the Class of '84 Sustainability Fund, which will support environmental initiatives here at Williams, both educational initiatives, but also help support putting Williams at the forefront of action on making the college itself sustainable and lower its environmental impact. So I'm very proud of our class and what we've done to put that together, and I think this is an excellent an excellent way to talk about the same issues that our gift means to impact. So let me introduce very quickly who is here. They've been giving me a hard time because basically what I did was call them or email them and say, would you guys do this panel for me? And I really want to get you on this panel, and then I turned it over to Stephanie to kind of organize it, and I disappeared. So I've had nothing to do with this except pestering them all to get involved. Starting at the far end, Mara Boone, who is CEO of Green Cross Australia, which is Mikhail Gorbachev's organization, works, and they'll all talk in more detail about what they do, but they work primarily with the humanitarian aspects of environmental issues. Next to Mara is Peg Stevenson, who is in San Francisco, is currently city services auditor there, and also spent 11 years with Greenpeace in the U.S. and around the world. Next to Peg is Bill Edmonds, who is Director of Sustainability and Environmental Policy for Northwest Natural in Portland, natural gas company, and has been involved in the energy business since graduation. And the next to Bill is Jim Newman, who's a consultant in Cambridge, right here in the state of Massachusetts, for a company called Industrial Economics, dealing with government and NGOs, entities on consulting in environmental economics. And finally, our moderator, who I'm going to turn this over to and let them sort of get into the meat of the matter, Stephanie Boyd. I actually know Stephanie because one of the years I was here as an assistant or a visiting professor in theater. Shows you how much I know about the environment. I was here in theater. I don't know anything about the environment. But my office was right across the hall from Stephanie. And we had a good time. She would listen to me, playing the keyboard in the middle of the night. Anyway, Stephanie is now the director of the Zilka Center for Environmental Initiatives at Williams. And really, she's also talking tomorrow, I forget what time it's in the program, 2 o'clock, about specifically what Williams is doing relative to sustainability and the environment. Our hope today is to take this panel to look at how we all have an impact on that issue from Williams and beyond. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it over to the panel and to Stephanie.
Thanks. Greg. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming indoors on this beautiful sunny afternoon in Williamstown. And I'd like to start our conversation today with saying what a great honor it is to be on this stage with this illustrious group of Williams alum. And as I began to think about our discussion today, I wanted to know more about where my fellow panelists had their beginnings. So while I have spent the last several years working with great colleagues, faculty and staff and students at Williams College, trying to reduce our environmental footprint, the Williams of '84 was essentially unknown to me, so I did a little research. And I've learned that in many ways, things are still the same, but there are some significant changes going on in our classrooms, around the campus, and on the global stage. In 1967, many of you probably know this, President John Sawyer announced the opening of the Center for Environmental Studies at Williams, reportedly the first of such centers to be founded at a liberal arts college. I think there's another college, though, that states the same claim, so we won't name that school. And at that time, President Sawyer said, "Our goal will be to foster the kinds of analyses, decisions, and recommendations for action that can help set in motion responses by several levels of government and community leadership, which are needed while there is still time to choose among the environmental options before us. Almost no other subject is more closely related to the central humane values of liberal learning, its concern for the condition of quality of life for men on Earth. While the remarks of President Sawyer remain valid today, I somehow think he might have hoped we'd have made greater progress than we have. We would not be so familiar with the terms of climate change, climate crisis, global warming, sustainability. We would not be studying how to mitigate the worst effects of climate change that are happening in the world today. Our colleagues on the panel did not come to school in '67. At that time, they were starting in grammar schools across the country, while Williams was laying the foundation for their education. But they arrived here in the early '80s. And at that time, we were very much aware of energy issues, having experienced skyrocketing oil prices, long lines at gas stations as a result of the oil shocks of the late '70s. The general public, though, had not yet connected consumption of fossil fuels with climate change and would not for many years to come. But our panelists had the benefit of learning from several people who I'm happy to say are still vibrant participants in the Williams intellectual community. Among them are Dr. Bill Muma, Dr. David DeChair, Roger Bolton, Sheaf Satterwhite, Tom Jorling, and Nancy Nyland. What we'll learn today is how our colleagues have grown in their professional careers, have considered the issues of environmentalism around the world, and what they see that brings us both optimism and pessimism. I'd like to ask Jim to start our discussion.
Great, thanks. I'm going to stand. And I didn't need these 25 years ago. But I'm happy to be back in Williamstown. I've been lucky enough to have been back here a few times in the last several years. I was in this space in April of '08. There weren't as many people. Speaking at a conference for adapting to climate change in developing countries. And then this January, I gave a log lunch a few days after the inauguration of our current president. And that talk was called Environmental Economics and Air Pollution Policy. Is a bird worth more when there is no bush? So I have to credit my daughter. She helped me a lot with that title. And that talk is really about what I do. I'm the heartless guy who puts dollar values on things that ought not be priced. So birds, bunnies, wetlands, and old people. So this thing about valuing lives, as you might guess, gets misinterpreted a lot. This ad was part of a little flap over the use of a lower value for the protection of lives of seniors rather than other folks. And there were a few senior appointees at EPA and OMB in the last administration who thought this was a really good idea. Old folks are closer to dying, so why don't we spend less effort trying to reduce environmental risks that could prolong their lives? Those back for your 50th will be happy to know EPA doesn't discount senior lives anymore. It turns out the economics literature never supported it. And I actually agree with where they are now. Probably our government ought not place a lower value on protecting the lives of seniors. But if we think about this a little bit, I would guess some of us would be willing to give up some of the protection for ourselves if it meant there were more resources for less fortunate, more vulnerable, or the younger. And I'm going to hit back on that theme in a minute. So here's something else I work on. This is a lead smelter. It's in Herculaneum, Missouri. I hope none of you have ever had the misfortune to go there. These days, lead that gets produced at this plant gets used mostly for lead-acid batteries. Anybody here drive a car? So you're part of the demand for lead from this plant. Most of the lead gets recycled now, but there are still problems at this plant, as that sign attests. Can you read that sign, by the way? Can you read? It's troubling to me that it's hard to believe, really, that there are places in this country where a sign like this would still be needed. My work contributed a tiny little bit to making the air emission standards at places like this, where lead is emitted through these tall stacks, 10 times more stringent than it's been for the prior 20 years. Doing that, taking that action at the federal level was a nod to sustainability. To meet that standard, this plant's going to have to be rebuilt. It'll be more expensive for all of us to buy car batteries. Sorry. But it's going to make us, and mostly kids and future generations, healthier and smarter, as it turns out. So this is my first sustainability challenge, since we're going to talk about some challenges here, right? Recognizing problems like this and using technology to address them. I actually think this one is easy. We know how to do it. Most of what I do these days is about climate change. I do a lot of work on sea level rise. And as the world warms, sea level is going to go up because warmer water takes up more volume, and also because ice on land that's currently on land is going to melt. So sea level rise, it'll inundate some low-lying areas, but this is actually what I'm more worried about. This is not an inundation map. Sea level is going to rise about 2 or 3 feet. This is what the 100-year storm will look like in lower Manhattan. So the light blue is areas that will be flooded. What's going to happen is, with higher seas, storms that we get now will be launched from a higher plane, and they'll go farther inland and be more damaging. Storms don't have to get more violent for this to happen. This is a pretty certain thing to happen. And this sort of thing worries me. The last time we had a flood like this in New York City was 1812. So it's been a while. We're not quite ready for this storm, I think. There was a similar sort of storm, but not nearly as bad, in 1950. Sorry for the grainy pictures. But that's LaGuardia Airport in the Lower East Side, and it looks pretty grim. One scientist says a flood like this by mid-century could happen every 25 years instead of every 100 years. I plan to be around in 40 years, so I don't want to see that happen. By the end of the century, it could be every 5 or 10 years. While that seems a long way off, that's a heck of a risk. So basically, what will it take to address this? It's going to take all of us, particularly in places like the U.S., to use less energy. And Bill's going to talk a lot more about this than I will, and I'm going to wrap up in a second. But the simplest explanation I've seen for what it would take to address climate change comes from a New Yorker article by Elizabeth Colbert, who actually is a Williamstown resident, but she went to Yale. She reports on something called the 2,000-watt society. Some European scientists have estimated that to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, we all have to turn ourselves into a society that uses roughly the equivalent of 20 100-watt light bulbs on a continuous basis, and no more. So none of the European scientists who have actually started this movement actually are 2,000-watt folks. They have an engineer on staff who is, and what he has to do in order to be a 2,000-watt person, he lives comfortably, but he uses renewable heat to heat his home. He works in a very smart, energy-efficient office, and he bikes to work. He doesn't own a car. I think I read there's one person in our class who doesn't own a car, Carrie Malone. So if she's here, congratulations. Talk to her afterward, and she can tell you how they do it. You can't take airplane trips. What's that? Damn, too late. You can't take airplane trips either. And you know, I think all of us here take airplane trips, and that's going to blow our 2,000-watt society. But it's quite a challenge. And I think Bill Mumaw spent a long time talking about these challenges yesterday. What I want to do is conclude with just this statement of what sustainability is and a couple of thoughts about what it would take to get there. This statement was put together by the Grow Harlem Brundtland Commission, which is a UN commission from just a little bit after we graduated. There's a lot in this statement, but I want to pull out 3 thoughts. First, the concept of needs. Okay, that's in here. The UN folks who put this statement together were actually thinking about the essential needs of the world's poor, so keep that in the back of your mind. The second is limitations on the environment's ability to meet our needs. And the third is balance between present and future generations. I think that we can design economic tools, we can design a market to address the second of these pieces, the limitation on the environment's ability to meet those needs. The lead example I showed you is one example of that. And we just have to price carbon. Okay, we can talk more about that in the question and answer, but cap and trade, tax hunt, this could be a lively debate if it were a group of economists about which of those to do. It's all about pricing carbon. Once we do that, we'll send signals to everybody all the time about the consequences of their actions. Everybody, not just people who are highly educated and aware like the people in this room, but everybody all the time. That's a necessary step at the societal level. But I don't think we're going to get to the point of taking care of the world's poor and achieving balance between present and future generations with technicians like me at the helm. We'll need to do other things too, and a liberal education will be a critical part of that. So I went looking around my house. These are the last two thoughts I'll leave you with. I went looking around my house for a couple of inspirations for ways we might start to achieve those two goals. And I found two. Number one was a quote I want to read you. In every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. Does anybody recognize that? That's on toilet paper. My wife buys 7th generation toilet paper. This is apparently a statement from the Iroquois nation. And it's inspiring to me. It's actually quite a challenge to think 7 generations into the future. So at any rate, that was one sort of pedestrian inspiration for me. The other was seeing the 25th anniversary, or the 25th reunion book. Sean did a great job putting this together, so did many others. What I saw in there was two themes that I think make me optimistic about trying to get to this sustainability challenge here. One is almost everybody talks about, particularly parents anyway, about dedication to their kids. That's the best recognition, I think, of emphasis on the future and an ability to sort of suspend present needs for some future payoff. And the other is wanting to leave a better world behind for everybody. Those are actually simple thoughts that are really the essence of sustainable thinking. So I'm going to sit down and let Bill talk some more about energy. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks.
Good job. All right.
While Bill's getting ready, I just wanted to mention that we are going to ask all the panelists to spend a few minutes talking, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So please hold your questions until then.
Okay, it feels a little like a backyard barbecue here. I'm just going to sort of pace in front of these folks. I'm a little like a caged animal. You heard I was from Portland. Portland is a town, Portland, Oregon, is a town that prides itself in kind of reaching towards sustainability. And what that means is everybody's talking about sustainability. Backyard barbecues are talking about sustainability. The guy at the power company is, the mayor is, the guy who owns the local pizza parlor is talking about sustainability. He's turned it into an advantage, and he's selling more pizzas because of it. That's how it's happening in Portland, and that's not, I know, unique. I think a lot of you are in towns that are feeling the same kind of bubbling. What I'm going to do is, what I find in all these sort of vague conversations about sustainability is they do get vague, and it's hard to reach at them. I'm going to dig a little deeper, drill some wells, if you will, in an area where I know, which is energy, and focus in a little bit in some specific areas, hoping we can draw some broader messages from those. That's a little warning that we're going to fly a little low into energy, so kilowatt hours and therms, just as a warning. Okay, first of all, where does energy come from today, and where does it need to come from? And if I was doing PowerPoint, there'd be 3 slides here, or 3 pictures. The first picture is where does most of our energy come from? Picture a 500 megawatt plant, coal going in one side, or natural gas going in one side, and kilowatt hours, all right, that's just the juice, coming out the other side. Bunch of problems with that model. One of the problems is that 50% of the energy goes up the stack in wasted energy. Can't do that. So there's a little 2-step dance, if you will, towards sustainability. The first step is shrink that power plant down to about the size of a car and shove it into the basement of the building. What's so good about that? You still got emissions, you still got burning fossil fuels. Well, you gather that heat that was lost, and you put it to work in the building. I worked on a project that did just that at a small school like this, and we're heating the swimming pool with all that waste heat. You got to do things like that as you move towards sustainability. But still fossil fuels going into that, gas. I work for the gas company. What's the next step in that 2-step dance? Picture a house, if you will, with a thermal solar on one side, PVs on the other, so you're making hot water for your shower, you're making electricity for your electrical needs, maybe there's some small windmills around the edge of the roof for good measure. Eventually, that house will be completely off the grid, but we need to think a bit of a hybrid future. Call me an incrementalist if you will, but we're having trouble getting all the way there. And so for a while, you're going to bring some electricity and you're going to bring some gas to the home before you can snip those 2 wires. That's why we need to think about a hybrid future and a distributed future in the electric sector. Hybrid because we got to cobble together systems just like the Prius does. Doesn't quite get there all the way. It's got a motor and an engine. We need to think about the same thing as we get to a house that's fully off-grid. So that's where energy comes from. What about sort of this is now into the social sciences. a little lesson that I've seen, maybe a surprise I've seen out in the energy world. Policies create markets, and markets are creating policy. Oh, hang on to that one. Policy creates markets. We learned about that. We learned about that 28 years ago in Environmental Studies 101, that policy was going to create environmental markets. 10 years before our class, the Clean Air Act had been passed. We were trading allowances to reduce sulfur emissions. So it's been around for a long time. And probably when we were sitting in that class, we wouldn't believe it, that we would be back here at our 25th reunion and that Congress would still be trying to struggle through creating a carbon market. That's where we are. Our Congress is a slow-moving conservative institution, and we're about ready to get there, to get to a carbon market that will reach into every piece of our economy if done right. So what's the other piece? That's policy creates markets. I say that I've learned something out there in the world, which is markets are creating policy. And this will be a little controversial, I think. I've been both in a power company and in a gas company. In the power company, a special product where people could buy wind. Now I'm in the gas company. People can buy a special product which is promoting biogas from dairy farms. We're going to clean it up, put it on our system, and it's going to heat your house one day. So there are markets like that that are creating an energetic, energized, knowledgeable base of people who are willing to vote with their wallet at first, and then willing to vote in elections that say, you know what, we want more renewable power. We know that electricity doesn't come from the wall socket. We used to think it did, but now we know more about it. And these products are energizing people in a way that they weren't energized before. So let me come back, and this will be my last point. Let me come back to that pizza guy. I said that he was talking about sustainability. So what do you do if you run a pizza restaurant and you really want to do the sustainable thing? He measures where his food comes from before he measures the miles the food travels before it goes onto the pizza. He doesn't do this as a PR gimmick. He doesn't even tell his customers that he's doing this. But that's what he thinks that a responsible pizza parlor would do in a sustainable world. So he ran into a problem. You know that Hawaiian pizza you buy? Canadian bacon, and then that wonderful pineapple. Carbon footprint of pineapple, forget it. It's off the pizza. Happily, Oregon has these wonderful sweet pears, and he slices those pears up, and it's on the Hawaiian pizza. And I guess I leave you with this path to sustainability is going to be filled with surprises. Surprises maybe only that liberal arts education might get you ready for. Surprises like pear on your Hawaiian pizza. And I guess the question is, will we be ready for it? Are we educating the next group of sustainability experts so that they're ready for it and able to guide us through? Thanks.
Thanks.
I think I'm going to use this mic over here. And I had to tell Bill that nobody eats that Hawaiian pizza. That's a myth. So thank you for having us, and Greg and everybody for organizing the panel. It really was fun to think about it and prepare for it. It made me think about the reunion and my Williams education in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. Otherwise, it would have been the same as my college years. It would have been all about drinking coming here. So I think I chose to talk a little bit about the activist perspective. I had a 10-year career in the activist world, working for Greenpeace. It was my first major job out of college, and I spent those years working primarily on energy and climate issues from a wide-ranging perspective. We were trying at the time to stop the Reagan-era plans to drill for oil off the coast of California, and so we had a running campaign up and down the West Coast and many other places, using every tool at hand, local policy, federal policy, local organizing to try and stop those things. And we were very successful, I have to say, although crack is starting to open in that same issue again right now. But I wanted to jump into that to just sort of reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot of reasons certainly to be pessimistic in the climate world. And Jim's slide of what New York will look like in a 100-year storm is one of them. And when you think about global warming and climate change, it can be very, very overwhelming, and that's hard to take sometimes. But just putting on my activist hat from 25 years ago and my Greenpeace career, I was really thinking about how much things have changed now so that we're talking about sustainability in the pizza, and people have these issues on their mind all the time, and they're legitimate issues for national elections. When I started working in the environmental biz, it was all about pollution control. That was the lingo and the concept of the day. Then it quickly became pollution prevention, a slightly more advanced concept, and one that let you bring some more economic and social and political tools to hand. Then economic efficiency. Then moving quickly through the 80s and 90s, the closed loop system. Remember all that discussion about closed loop? And now we're at sustainability, which I think is really a sort of next generation of that same concept. People talk about the triple bottom line in our business where I am in San Francisco: economic, environmental, and social goods all coming true at once. And just think about how different that is than it was in the 80s when I started working for Greenpeace. We were deadly afraid to say anything, for example, about cars. You can't work on policy. People will never stop driving. If you say anything about how they should drive less, that's going to be so unpopular, they just turn you off right away. Greenpeace never cared particularly about being unpopular, so we did a fair amount of that. But I just think I'm so encouraged and optimistic when I think about the more than 180-degree turn in conceptual thinking and politics that's happened since the days that I was doing local organizing. And now we're on the drive for everything to be carbon neutral and for us all to be locavores. I mean, those are very advanced concepts. It's amazing. So I have an audience participation element to my talk, so if you want to start to get nervous, this is the time. So I want you to think about something that you don't think will happen in your lifetime, but should. Okay, so everybody has an idea like that in their mind, right? So think about that thing. And think about how you're going to say it out loud. You need a simple phrase, a way to articulate it when I get to the end of my remarks. So just think about that for a second. So all that narration of sort of environmental organizing policy are things that I didn't necessarily think were going to happen in my lifetime. And so many things have happened. Like, think about it. The Berlin Wall, Nelson Mandela, walking to freedom. I was thinking about this because my good friends Navjeet and Eric are here, and Eric participated in a hunger strike against the campus in 1983 to try and force Williams to get out of apartheid-supporting investments. Remember that? And now Nelson Mandela is free and was president of South Africa, and I didn't think that was going to happen in my lifetime, but now it's long past, and I'm going to live several more years, I hope. Knock on wood. Many of the ideas that Greenpeace worked for in the 80s when I was working there are really now accepted as a given. Again, didn't think it would happen in my lifetime. My work now, my title is extremely terrible, City Services Auditor, but it's a lot more exciting than it sounds. I work for the City of San Francisco in the Controller's Office, which is mostly financial management and revenue and that kind of thing, but the group that I run has a bunch of auditors and analysts and people whose job it is to make public services work better, and which is fascinating, as you can imagine. I'm going to take as a given for a moment of all the policies that things like Jim and Bill articulated that dense urban development is critical to sustainability. So that's sort of the how I link my environmental past to my urban current. Urban dwellers use less resources, they drive less, they live in smaller and more efficient spaces, they share public amenities. So that's really what I think about in the work that I do now and the environment. It really channels, when you do that kind of development, growth into urban life and civic life rather than into auto-dependent suburbs, which are still one of our big problems, at least in California. The policies that we can work on in San Francisco to be able to stop climate change, again, not a lot of worrying about what the answers are. We know these answers, same like we did when we were working for Greenpeace. In my little city that I work on, we need to work on managing the parking supply. We need to permit more and denser housing, against the desires of some of the residents. We need to build a downtown transit center to make sure that we're the regional hub, and because the people who work in downtown San Francisco ride transit about half the time, which is much, much more than most of the population. We need to change the way planes taxi at SFO. I mean, there's some very straightforward things that we can do to make sure that our city has less of an impact on the environment. And the work that I do, again, about dense urban development sustainability, running a big city is a dirty job. It's a lot about making the buses work and the hospitals and the jails. I work on those things all the time, trying to analyze them, make sure that they work better so that people can live in the city and want to build their lives there so that they don't feel like they need to move out to the suburbs to get everything they want out of life. Our city works in dynamic tension. We have a lot of great politics, the very involved nonprofits, political organizations, and I'd much rather have that problem than trying to get people interested in any of these sustainability things. So it's a great set of issues to work on. Local and regional governments, I think, really stepped into some of the national vacuum that's been there since Bush was president. His having completely abdicated our responsibilities on global warming, despicable. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of Republicans among us, but you think about what happened back when we changed presidents just recently. So Bush made a joke as he was leaving office about being the world's biggest polluter in an interview that he gave to the Daily Telegraph. Think about that. He made a joke about it. But Obama, our man Obama, he's going to fix everything, right? Let's hear it for Obama. Here's his quote during the election. He said, "Generations from now, we will be able to look back and tell our children that this was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal." He said that. So that's the difference between Bush and Obama. Hey, Obama! So getting back to the local government idea, again, I think local government stepping into that vacuum was really, really important. It'll be slightly less so as national politics start to gain steam. And everybody has to support everything that's going to change our national politics. So you need to write to your legislators. You need to get involved in the climate change bill that's working its way through Congress right now. It would be really, really easy for this political moment to slip away. I was looking back again at some of my Williams things. I wrote an article for the journal that's published by the Environmental Center back in 1993 when we thought we were sort of at the same moment. So all the technology was poised to be profitable right then. And then the first Iraq War. And the political moment, evaporated like that. So that could happen. It could easily happen. So I just want to urge everybody to get involved right now. Stephanie asked us to talk a little bit about directly linking our Williams education and our sort of personal and issues to sustainability now. So I just thought I would mention, so political work and action, I think that's such a responsibility of all of us. There's not all that much evidence that sort of militant recycling and simple living is actually going to be the thing, as much as that's important. So you have to be political, you must. You could have fewer children. I would recommend homosexuality, personally. It doesn't work for everyone, but it works. It worked for me. Infill development. So again, you might not so much be in favor of this in your town. They built a big set of apartments right in a vacant lot behind my house. And I was one of the people in our neighborhood who didn't oppose it because infill development, that's the right place to build housing, is in the vacant lot right behind my house in San Francisco. You can stop driving. I do not own a car. So I'm one of those people in our class. I ride my bike to work and sometimes walk, but I'm very aware also that I had the money to buy the house in San Francisco so that I can do that. I mean, lots of people were forced economically to make a different choice. What are the responsibilities of Williams? That's something Stephanie asked us to comment on as well. I really think that progressive institutions have to continue to be the lead, federal policy notwithstanding. So colleges and universities, cities, nonprofits, communities have to drive the change. And I think again about my work in San Francisco. So people laugh at a lot of the things that we do. Oh, goofy San Francisco, ha ha ha, right? So people laughed about things like our requirement that the city buy recycled paper. That wasn't there very long. Now that kind of thing is a complete no-brainer. People laughed about that at the time. They laughed at the equal benefits ordinance that requires companies we do business with to offer health benefits to domestic partners. Again, that's very much on the profit centers of most companies now. People laughed at the time. At car share, again, a standard sustainability policy that lots of cities are trying to build. We have a local health insurance ordinance in San Francisco, which we're just about a year of experience of trying to provide health insurance to indigent adults who aren't otherwise eligible for any public health insurance. And if you go to San Francisco, many of the restaurants have a little tagline on their menu telling you that $1.50 is going to be added to your bill to cover the cost of health insurance. Pay it happily. You want the people who work in restaurants to have health insurance, and that's what we're trying to do, again, stepping into the vacuum there. So Williams, there's the admonition about aiming high on the steps over here. progressive institutions have to aim high. They have to swing for the fence. I mean, there's enough natural conservatism in all of our politics so that colleges really have to do that, and that's one of Williams' responsibilities. The last thing I'm going to say is sort of, again, the perspective on our liberal learning. I so much value my education here. I'm a generalist now, and I think that I do a good job sort of able to see how all the policies in our city help contribute to what we're trying to do environmentally and socially. That's partly to do with my liberal arts exposure. I'm not a scientist or an economist, but I understand them, and I know what they're talking about, partly because of my liberal arts education here at Williams, and I appreciate them. I had some wonderful exposure to science while I was here. Bill and I were together at the Williams Mystic program, marine biology, and extractive industries seen in an experiential education setting, which I still think is very valuable experience. And liberal arts makes life more fun. My head is full of literary allusions and historical perspectives and things like that just make, some of the tedious things that I do to make the buses and the hospitals and the jails work a lot more fun. So I really credit that. Okay, so here's your audience participation moment. This is what you've been dreading. So think of that thing that you think should change in your lifetime, but might not, and how you're going to verbalize it. And then I want you to stand up and say it out loud. And don't be embarrassed. We'll drown each other out if we all do that at once. So stand if you're able and say that thing out loud. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Say it out loud.
Poverty.
All right. Okay. So, now you've stood up for something you believe in.
Thank you, Kate. And now for our last speaker. One of the challenges of trying to moderate a panel of Williams alums is that they all have so many fascinating, interesting things to say that it breaks my heart to ask them to stop. But Mara, you're up.
Don't stop. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be back here. I live in Australia now, up in the north in Queensland, and I can see a number of you who I've connected with over Facebook over recent years. And this part of my life at Williams was such an important thing about framing who I am. And I'm so happy that my husband, Stu, who's up there in the stands, got a chance to come and actually see what this is all about. So I'm very grateful. I want you to hold on to the incredible optimism of Peg, because actually, despite what I'm about to say, I'm also profoundly optimistic, and maybe we can save some time for the questions about that. But, I work on the human focus on environmental stresses, and we sometimes reflect on how over the last 50 years, despite our different views on globalization, we actually have managed, despite a huge population, to bring a lot of people on this planet out of poverty. And there's a reasonable potential that many of those gains may be reversed as the planet warms and as those impacts of a warming planet sink home. So I really like focusing on the human focus, because I feel like if we confront these impacts, maybe that'll be a wake-up call if we relate at a values level about the human condition. It's not just as it once was. I also worked at Greenpeace years ago about the whales and the dolphins. It's all vital, of course, but it's actually about us. 25 years is a really important number. I heard this interview with a guy called Nate Lewis from Caltech about 10 years ago, and he talked about thermal inertia, and that was a wake-up call to me, because he said there's a 25-year lag time between the gradual warming of the atmosphere and how that warms our oceans, which of course have a big signal on our climate system. And what that actually means is the weather that we're experiencing today relates to the carbon pollution in the atmosphere when we graduated. And our kids 25 years from now will actually experience the impact of what we've managed to produce. And so reflecting on that, even if we stopped all greenhouse emissions right now, I had the incredible, I actually studied economics and political science here, but I had a wonderful opportunity to work for our science agency in Australia, which is quite large. It has 6,000 staff, 4,000 PhDs, leading climate scientists, especially on the science of sea level rise, which Jim touched on. And they really talk about how there is a 1 to 2 degree increase in average atmospheric temperatures built into the climate system now. and they have a consequence. And I want to tell you a little bit about the story of our region, the Asia-Pacific region, and then a little bit closer to home in how we are actually copying this right now in Australia in a very, very real way. So, as recently as 5 years ago, the consensus science indicated that the seas were rising at something like 1.7 millimeters a year. Gee, that doesn't sound too exciting, does it? 1.7 millimeters. That linear progression had an IPCC consensus of something like 0.6 to 0.8 of 1 meter over 100 years. But after reviewing through hard science, measuring the buoys in the oceans, in the southern oceans and so forth, that now looks more like 3.1 millimeters a year. And if you look at some of the tipping point scenarios that people like James Hansen from NASA and others are pointing to, it's the melting of the ice sheets, the Greenland thermal melt that's happening in the middle of that continent, literally. The fact that you can have kind of a plunking of big things like the West Antarctic shelf of ice that could literally displace quite a bit of water. And so some people are talking about more like 5 meters, and they don't know when that's going to happen, which makes it very, very diabolical. It is the combination, as Jim pointed out, of severe weather events with that gradual increase. And in the Asia Pacific, we've recently seen, for example, Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, which killed 145,000 people, displaced 800,000 people, and is one small chapter in what is increasingly considered a base case risk. According to the IPCC, that linear lounge rooms for 3 months of the year are now filled with water. This is happening here and now. But because the mega deltas of the world, the Irrawaddy, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong Delta, are places where tens of millions of people have aggregated. And when you get storm surge on top of an increasing salinity table that's already compromising agriculture, on top of drought conditions, there's parts of our country in Australia which have been in deep drought now for 15, 17, 18 years, generations of farmers, in despair. The highest suicide rate of Australia is in these farming communities under profound drought. According to the United Nations Global Compact report, which came out just last week, I saw it on the plane as we were coming over to California, already 300 million people on Earth are suffering profoundly from the impacts of climate change. And so this is something which draws back this notion of, in a sense, progress. You have to really think, what are we really exposed to? And I guess in that context for Australia right now, again, according to the IPCC, which I refer to because that is the consensus science, that's the science that's been peer-reviewed over many decades and stress-tested. According to that science, Australia is the developed country on the front line of the impacts of climate change. And let me tell you what we've been through this year. On Saturday, the 8th of February, we had a diabolical thing. We are tough, we go through fires and floods. We are, for many tens of thousands of years, our indigenous people have managed, a very delicate ecosystem, very, very harsh weather. But on the 8th of February, we had a combination of the hottest day on record, the driest day on record, and the windiest day on record. And do you know what happened? The flames that erupted outside of Melbourne, in Victoria, the fireball was 2.5 times the size of regular gum trees. Stu and I live on a property in the bush. We are trained in firefighting. We've cleared the bush around our house. We have a pump. We put in a big pool for water. We're off the water grid, so we've got lots of tanks. People like us were living there prepared, and do you know what happened? In 24 hours, 174 people died, and we all watched it on television. And what made it even more vivid, our public radio station, our national public radio, started broadcasting live from the fire zone. So the entire country just began to understand, my goodness, this is no longer the theory that we learned about in environmental chemistry with Bill Mumon in 1982, This is here and now. And the science agency that I work for and respect profoundly is predicting that by 2050, in this part of Victoria, we can expect 138% increase in extreme heat days. So we're actually preparing for an ongoing rate. Now, the remarkable thing about that experience was, simultaneously, we had 20,000 Australians flooded out in the north of our country. 20,000 people. The flood was so big that for the first time in 17 years, we now have an inland sea. So, we are absolutely clear that the impacts of what we've created years and years ago are here, and we're also clear that we have an obligation to tell the rest of the world that really from our perspective now, this is no longer a theory. We also went through a very conservative government that, for better or for worse, and, there are many views, didn't opt into global discussions for a decade or so. And we have a diabolical concoction. We are the world's biggest exporter of coal. So our economy, which is a thriving export economy, is based on cheap, dirty coal. And do you know what it's developing? China and India. Mm-hmm. And all those hundreds of millions of people who need to be elevated out of poverty. And what is it that does it? Electricity. And who are we to say now, I'm so sorry, but because I've got 3 widescreen TVs, I'm really worried about your first car. So it's kind of a diabolical concoction, but where we're coming back on it is where a lot of my optimism comes from. Our focus is on human resilience. So, half of the work that we do is completely cool. And my optimism, I was talking to Stephanie about it, it's about working with young people. It's about high school students and university students across Australia. And we're inspiring an entire generation of young people to realize that we now very quickly need to learn first aid, become volunteer firefighters, become volunteer flood workers. In Australia, because of our harsh weather, we have 500,000 emergency volunteers. It's an amazing group of people, but the average age is 52. So we're doing this on Facebook in rock concerts. We get young people dressed in fire suits to front before the big music acts and say, you know what? This actually is no longer about climate change. It's about our weather and our future, and here's what we need to do to help. And the back end of that, which is inspired by this amazing community that I just couldn't believe it. Has anyone seen the story of Greensburg, Kansas? There's a documentary coming on Discovery. It's been done by the Sundance. This is a small town in the middle of Kansas, the most unexpected example. They were flattened by a tornado 2 years ago, and they have decided to rebuild green. And the story of it is incredible because these are farmers and small businesses. They've got silos. And the whole thing is going to be on, LEED 7-star rated out there, and all the kids are coming back. And we are taking a page out of that. So we're leading a massive green rebuilding area in these bushfire communities. And it has to be resilient, which is tough because it's got to be safe, and that's very greenhouse intensive. But we have to power it with renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. I want to close and then, hopefully open for questions that can draw all of this together with just a sense of perspective that one gets being outside of the U.S. about the importance of the U.S. at this stage of our common challenge, about managing the climate that really will dictate life. And Australians really need the U.S. now to take a leadership role. Climate change is among the top 3 issues for the general Australian public. 72% of Australians want strong climate action. Our government is under pressure from the coal industry, so our sort of path to Copenhagen is not very exciting. It's very, very low cuts. However, our community is far ahead of our politicians, and we have been strong allies of the Americans. Sean Crotty last night, we're sitting after the log having drinks, and he sang this wonderful ballad about the Anzacs, in World War I in Gallipoli, and made Stu cry. And, we have been there in every war. We have been there in World War I, in World War II, in Vietnam. We were in Iraq, we're in Afghanistan. We need you now to take leadership. And the thing that I think is really amazing is you guys are the guys that are taking leadership. I mean, this is actually happening on our watch. And I'm just so grateful to, kind of be a part of it. So, thanks.
Thanks so much.
The best discourse I've seen on this is by Bill Nordhaus, who's a Yale economist, and he actually gave a keynote speech in Copenhagen. This was sort of a precursor to the negotiations that will happen in Copenhagen at the end of the year. And he said very strongly, a carbon tax is so much more tractable than cap and trade. And his reasons have to do with things like ease of enforceability, the ability to harmonize it across countries. If you're really going to build an international system, it's going to be much easier to do through a tax system. He's probably more optimistic than some folks about the ability of non-OECD countries to tax carbon, whether they have the institutions to do it. But I think he feels if they don't have the institutions to tax carbon, they don't have the institutions to build a cap and trade system either. It's much more complicated. The last point I'll share on that is a personal one, which is I actually favor a carbon tax over cap and trade. I think you can design them to be equally sort of invasive in the economy, equally sort of impactful, if you will. I think the cap and trade leaves a lot open for mischief. A lot of favors can be doled out without much scrutiny. It's harder to do that with a tax.
Militant recycling may not work. You got to be political. But I do think finding something you're passionate about in the world of sustainability helps you be political. The concrete helps you to move into the broader conversation. I have a friend who's passionate about bees, another one who's passionate about seeds, and they connect those to sustainability. I'm becoming more and more passionate about my bike and getting into that little traffic jam on the Hawthorne Bridge on my bike gives me great pleasure. That isn't going to change the world, and doing that every day isn't going to change the world, but it gives me sort of some of the energy that I can take into the political world, where I do think the big changes need to be made.
I guess I could comment on that too. Sure. I mean, again, just any form of political participation really does make a difference. I say that as an organizer when you're trying to get your legislators or your congressperson or anybody, if they've heard from one constituent, they think that there are 10 people who think that at least. That's still true. So it's really important that you lean on your political leadership. And then when I say progressive institutions need to take the lead, we all belong to these things. We're part of churches and schools and companies and other institutions where if you have a policy that can help drive behavior in your industry, it can help be a meaningful, impactful form of access. People who are doing local organizing can point to a network of schools and churches that are doing these things. So any institution that you're involved in that can show some leadership.
Our mission is to foster a global values shift towards a secure and sustainable future. And it's about making that connection at the heart. Changing the light bulb is easy. We'll actually start doing it in a meaningful way if the change is at our heart. I'll give you a sense on the economics because it is absolutely diabolical. And the problem is it's not just the short-term political cycles, it's our business cycles. It's the fact that bonuses get paid on quarterly returns, and the media cycle is 24/7, so it's even faster. In Australia, the investments in meaningful renewable energy will price carbon at least $60. Some say it's as much as 85 Australian dollars a ton. It's likely that we will actually price carbon for the next 15 years at $20 a ton. That actually means not much will happen. And I've sat in rooms with executives of major oil companies that say, we are good to go on all kinds of things at $65. Our entire bonus is driven on doing nothing until it gets there. And that's the 25-year dilemma. And my personal view is, it is up to us as individuals who are in those businesses and those governments and, all of the challenges that we're facing with society to take a longer-term view because it's about our kids. It's not as simple as expense. Having said that, I'm also very realistic. We had a wonderful, very idealistic election, as I think you've had as well. We're about a year and a half ahead of you on this. What was a very progressive stance in terms of Kyoto and cuts has now watered down to our position for Copenhagen is a 5% cut on 2000 levels. Okay? The scientists that I work with are prepared to get undressed and run through the streets. They're that terrified because of that hockey stick that Al Gore talked about. So, how do we break that cycle? I think we have to just raise the urgency of it politically, in the work that we do, in the communities that we live in, and lead our politicians because they're clearly following opinion polls. We've got to lead them.
Thank you, Mara. I'm sorry, we really have to go, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. Please don't stop the conversation. This is one that we all need to have every day. I think we've seen glimpses of optimism from our panelists, that there are many ways for us to enter into contributing to this issue in our personal lives, professional lives, and politically, and I urge you all to do so. A nice round of applause for our...
Thank
Good
you.
job.